Hey fam, glad to have you back. Before we step into today's mystery, Sherlock Holmes and the echoes from the Sunken cathedral, tell me this. What brought you a little peace today? And where in the world are you tuning in from? I'll soon be reading out a few of your messages in the next episode, so don't be a stranger. Now find your quiet corner, pour yourself a warm cup of something good, and settle in, because in the world of whispers in the fog, the past doesn't stay buried, and every echo has a story. Chapter 1. A Cry from the Depths. The autumn of 1895 had settled heavily upon London, its grey veils of mist coiling about the city's spires and gaslit alleys like a shroud. In our snug quarters at 221B Baker Street, the world outside seemed almost another country, distant, dim, and faintly unreal. I had just returned from my rounds at the surgery, chilled and weary, and found Holmes in a familiar posture, now sprawled languidly across the settee, his long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, his gaze fixed upon a single scrap of paper. The fire hissed and crackled in the grate. Mrs. Hudson, bless her, had left a tray of tea and a covered plate beside the hearth, though Holmes had plainly ignored them. His mind, I could tell, was elsewhere. "Good evening, Holmes," I said, shaking off my coat. "Or anything to disturb the sacred peace of Baker Street tonight?" Holmes's eyes flickered toward me, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Disturb it indeed, Watson," he murmured. "I expect we shall have a visitor presently who will shatter it most effectively." I glanced at the mantel clock. It was nearly 9, hardly the hour for polite callers. A client? A client, or something considerably more intriguing, Holmes said, tapping the folded paper in his hand. "Observe." He tossed it lightly to me. Unfolding it, I saw a few hastily scribbled lines. "Urgent assistance required. Matter of utmost secrecy. Please receive me without delay. E. Carradine." "Carradine," Holmes mused, clasping his hands behind his head. "Does the name stir any memory, Watson?" I furrowed my brow. "It seems familiar. A clergyman, perhaps, or an antiquarian?" "Both, in fact. Reverend Elias Carradine, an esteemed scholar of early English churches. His lectures on submerged parishes along the Thames were a sensation last spring." Holmes's expression sharpened. "A curious coincidence, for it so happens that this very afternoon news reached me of a most singular phenomenon. The ruins of St. Ethelred's, a sunken cathedral, long thought lost to the river, have re-emerged after the recent drought. And now, here we are, with the Reverend himself sending a desperate summons." Before I could venture a reply, rapid footsteps echoed upon the stairs, and a sharp rap sounded at the door. "Enter!" Holmes called. The door swung open to admit a gaunt figure, his face lined with both age and anxiety. His clerical collar sat askew, and his hands, clasped around a battered leather satchel, trembled visibly. His wet shoes and dripping cloak spoke of hurried travel through the misty streets. "Mr. Holmes! Dr. Watson!" he gasped, removing his hat with shaking fingers. "Forgive my intrusion, but I am a man pursued by dread, forces beyond my understanding." Holmes rose and gestured to the man toward the armchair opposite him. "You are among friends, Reverend Carradine. Compose yourself, I pray to you, and tell us precisely what has befallen." Carradine sank heavily into the chair, casting wary glances at the dark windows behind him, as though expecting unseen eyes to peer within. "It is St. Ethelred's," he whispered. "The cathedral, what is left of it, has surfaced, and with it something terrible." Watson and I exchanged a quick glance. Holmes, however, leaned forward with keen interest, the firelight glinting off his sharp features. "You must be specific, sir," he said gently but firmly. "What terrible thing?" Carradine swallowed, his voice a dry rasp. "Voices, Mr. Holmes. Echoes from the depths. At dusk, the stones themselves seemed to speak. And worse, he hesitated, his eyes darting once more toward the window. Then, in a voice scarcely above a breath, he continued, "Last night, at the foot of the cathedral's exposed nave, a body was found." A tremor ran through the room, as though the very air thickened with the weight of his words. I leaned forward, my heart quickening. "A body," Holmes repeated softly. "Whose?" Carradine shuddered. "Mine to find, but not mine to identify. The corpse was clad in a manner no living soul would wear. A robe of ancient make, stitched with sigils long forgotten. And its face, gentlemen, its face was not that of a man recently deceased, but a visage twisted and withered by centuries." For a long moment the room was silent save for the steady ticking of the clock. Holmes rose at last, his movements swift and purposeful. "Watson," he said crisply, "fetch your coat. We leave at once. There is no time to lose." And with that, we were plunged headlong into one of the most haunting enigmas we had yet encountered. A case where the echoes of the past threatened to drown all reason. Chapter 2. The Secrets Beneath the Silt. The hansom cab rattled through the damp London streets, the horses' hooves striking sharp echoes from the glistening cobblestones. Holmes sat opposite me, his lean frame rigid with concentration, his sharp features half shrouded by the collar of his greatcoat. Reverend Carradine huddled beside me, his satchel clutched tightly, as though it contained the very soul of the mystery. "Tell me, Reverend," Holmes said at last, his voice low and deliberate, "what precisely drew you to St. Ethelred's after its reappearance?" Carradine's hands twisted nervously in his lap. "I had been following the reports, Mr. Holmes. St. Ethelred's was a great obsession of mine, an ancient house of worship, swallowed by the Thames in 1673 after the Great Surge. Legends clung to it, of course, as they do to all things lost. Whispers of a buried sect, forbidden rites, and treasures hidden in the crypts. I thought I might finally see for myself what lay beneath." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And did you?" Carradine shook his head, a grimace shadowing his lined features. "Only decay and horror. The nave and transepts have resurfaced, battered and broken, jutting from the silt like bones of some titanic corpse. The smell, Mr. Holmes, the reek of old death clinging to every stone, was almost unbearable." "And the body?" Holmes pressed. "You discovered it personally?" Carradine nodded. "I had gone alone, just after dusk. The river mist was thick, coiling low along the ground. I made my way down the embankment to the ruins, where the great western door had once stood. It was there, half buried among the stones and riverweed, that I saw it." He shivered, drawing his coat tighter around him. "It lay face down at first. I thought it was debris, a carved effigy perhaps, washed free by the currents. But as I approached, the thing moved, Mr. Holmes. Or rather, it seemed to, an unnatural shifting of the limbs, as if stirred by some invisible hand. Watson frowned. Perhaps the tide— Perhaps, Carradine agreed hastily. Perhaps the tide. I dared not turn it. Over. I fled. Only when I returned with the constable an hour later was it properly examined. Holmes made no comment, but his fingers drummed an impatient tattoo against the cab's wooden frame. And the constable? He asked. What was his impression? A man named Godfrey, a stout soul, but deeply superstitious. He was reluctant to touch the corpse at all, swearing it was not of this world. Eventually, 2 dock hands summoned from a nearby tavern helped to remove it. Holmes's drumming ceased abruptly. Where is the body now? In the mortuary at St. Swithin's Hospital. Dr. Willoughby, the coroner, has been charged with the examination. A wry smile touched Holmes's lips. Then St. Swithin's shall be our first port of call. The cab veered sharply, and Carradine nearly toppled into me as we turned into the hospital courtyard. The building loomed ahead, its grim facade made more forbidding by the swirling mist that clung to its iron railings. Holmes sprang lightly from the cab as it halted and offered Carradine a hand. Come, Reverend, let us confront your spectre. The porter at the hospital door recognized Holmes immediately, a testament to my friend's reputation, which extended into many dark corners of London. Wordlessly, he led us down a narrow stone corridor, our footsteps muffled against the damp flagstones. The mortuary door groaned as it swung open. Within, the air was cold and rank with the metallic tang of disinfectant. Rows of shrouded shapes lay on iron tables, silent and anonymous in death. At the far end, beneath a flickering gas lamp, stood a single uncovered figure. We approached slowly. Carradine hung back, pressing a handkerchief to his nose. Holmes stood over the body for several long moments, his sharp eyes taking every inch of it. I stepped closer, suppressing an involuntary shudder. The corpse was peculiar. Though clearly human, the skin had withered into a brittle, leathery husk, giving the impression of terrible antiquity. The garments were even stranger. A long robe of faded crimson, embroidered with symbols that were unfamiliar even to my well-read eye. Circles interlaced with serpents, crosses entwined with what looked like waves or roots. Holmes leaned in, brushing a gloved finger along the hem of the robe. Curious, he murmured. Very curious indeed. Without warning, he seized a magnifying lens from his pocket and inspected the stitching with intense focus. A faint frown marred his brow. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. Instead of answering directly, he plucked a stray thread from the garment and held it up to the gaslight, studying its frayed end. "This robe is no relic of the 17th century, Watson," he said softly. "It is far too new." I blinked, but Holmes's eyes gleamed with a fierce electric excitement. Someone, Watson, is attempting to conjure a ghost from history, and we are about to find out why. Behind us, a soft creak echoed in the corridor. Holmes straightened immediately. His hand flicked toward the door, and in a voice like steel he called, "Come in, sir, or would you prefer to continue lurking?" The gaslight flared as the door opened wider, and a shadowed figure draped in a dark coat stepped silently into the room. Chapter 3. The Man by the River. The figure that entered was a wiry man of middle years, his features narrow and sharp beneath the brim of a battered felt hat. His coat was of coarse material, spattered with dried mud at the hem, and his boots left wet impressions across the mortuary floor as he advanced cautiously into the lamplight. Holmes regarded him with a gaze as piercing as a rapier point. "Well, sir," Holmes said, his voice cool, "your presence here suggests you have some connection with the matter at hand. Kindly introduce yourself." The man shifted uneasily, removing his hat to reveal hair pressed flat to his skull with dampness. "Monsieur Enoch Dempsey," he muttered. "I work on the river, lighterman by trade. I was at the ruins this morning, same as half the city, poking about the stones." "And what precisely brought you skulking after us tonight, Mr. Dempsey?" Holmes asked. Dempsey swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I saw something, sir. I saw something I reckon you ought to know." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "We are listening." Dempsey glanced over his shoulder, as if fearful of being overheard, though the only other occupants of the room were the dead. "It wasn't that no ghost killed that poor devil," he said hoarsely. "It was a man. I saw myself lurking round the ruins not 2 nights past before the body was found." Holmes' interest sharpened visibly. "Describe him." Dempsey licked his lips. "Tall fella, broad in the shoulders, wore a long dark cloak, like one of them churchmen, but newer. Face was hidden beneath a wide hat, but I caught a glimpse as he passed, under the lamplight. Pale he was, and clean-shaven. Had a scar, here." He traced a line across his right cheek. Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "And what was this man doing?" "Digging, sir. Had a spade with him, digging among the stones, where the nave meets the old choir stalls. I didn't stay to watch it for long. Gave me a bad turn, it did. I scarpered." "You told no one?" Dempsey shifted uncomfortably. "Who'd listen to the likes of me? They'd say I was drunk or dreaming." Holmes tapped a finger thoughtfully against his lip. "You have done wisely to come forward now," he said. "One more question. Have you ever seen this man before?" Dempsey hesitated. "Can't say for sure, but he had the look of a gent, if you take my meaning. Not river folk." Holmes nodded curtly. "You may go, Mr. Dempsey, but remain within easy reach. I may need you again." Dempsey bobbed his head and slipped from the room with surprising swiftness, his boots squelching along the corridor. Holmes turned back to the corpse, his brows knitted in contemplation. "Watson," he said, "what do you make of our visitor?" I considered it. He seemed sincere enough, though I would hardly stake my reputation upon it. Just so. Yet there are details he could not have invented. The scar, the spade, the precise location. No, Dempsey has seen something, though whether he understands what he saw is another matter. Holmes bent once more over the corpse, scrutinizing the withered features. "A man in modern garb," he mused aloud, "buries a body in a robe, fashioned to suggest a relic of the 17th century. He stages the discovery amid the ruins of a long-lost cathedral, and he does so under cover of darkness, trusting the river mist to conceal his work." He straightened suddenly, his eyes gleaming. "There is a mind at work here, Watson, a mind as calculating as it is audacious." I felt a thrill run through me. The case, it was clear, had captured Holmes's full attention. At that moment, the door swung open again, and a stout man in a crumpled frock-coat bustled in, a folder of papers clutched under one arm. "Ah, Dr. Willoughby, I presume," Holmes said. The coroner blinked in mild surprise at being recognised, but quickly regained his composure. "You must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I was just preparing my notes for the constabulary." Holmes gestured toward the corpse. "Have you conducted your examination?" Willoughby nodded grimly. "A most unusual case. The body shows no signs of recent injury. No bruises, no lacerations. Cause of death is difficult to determine, but I lean towards suffocation, or perhaps poisoning." "Poisoning?" I asked, startled. Willoughby tapped the papers against his palm. "There are traces, a discoloration of the lips and tongue, that suggest some irritant. But without further chemical analysis, I cannot be certain." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and the age of the body. Willoughby hesitated. "I should say 2 days dead, no more." "2 days," Holmes murmured. "Not centuries." The coroner nodded, evidently relieved to find someone who did not subscribe to the more lurid rumours already spreading through the city. Holmes turned away, his cloak swirling about him. "Come, Watson, our next move is clear." As we stepped out into the fog-bound night, I glanced at Holmes. "Where to now?" He smiled thinly. "To St. Ethelred's, Watson. The cathedral still holds its secrets, and we must unearth them before the river swallows them once more." The mist closed around us as we vanished into the gloom. Chapter 4. Shadows Among the Ruins. The night pressed thick around us as we made our way along the embankment, the mist rising from the Thames in slow, curling eddies. Lanterns flickered dimly on their iron posts, their light barely piercing the heavy gloom. Holmes moved ahead with the quiet certainty of a hound following an invisible scent, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the wan gleam of gaslight. The path to St. Ethelred's led us down narrower lanes where the stones underfoot grew slick with river dew. Here and there the masts of moored barges loomed like phantom trees through the fog, their rigging creaking with the whisper of the tide. At last the broken outline of the cathedral emerged from the mist. Blackened stone arches thrusting from the mud like the ribs of some long-dead leviathan. Pools of brackish water glimmered among the collapsed walls, and the air carried a pungent stench of riverweed and decay. Holmes paused at the edge of the ruins, surveying the scene with sharp eyes. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "Nature and man alike conspire to erase their crimes, but neither so swiftly as they imagine." We picked our way carefully across the uneven ground, our boots sinking into the silty earth. The stones were slick and treacherous, and more than once I stumbled, steadying myself against the broken remnants of carved pillars and worn statues. Holmes led us to the spot Dempsey had described, the junction of the nave and the choir. The ground here had been disturbed. The silt churned up, stones shifted, weeds pulled aside in a rough circle. Holmes dropped to one knee, producing a small lantern from the depths of his coat. Shielding the flame with his hand, he cast a thin beam of light over the disturbed earth. "Fresh work," he muttered. "See how the silt has not yet been resettled. No more than 48 hours old." He traced the perimeter with the tip of his cane, his movements precise. "Note the imprint here, a heel mark, deep and narrow. Our scarred man wore heavy boots. I crouched beside him, peering at the faint impression. You deduce it was the same man Dempsey saw? Holmes gave a brief nod. There are few enough souls foolish enough to haunt this place after dark. The pattern of disturbance matches the account too neatly to be coincidence. He rose, dusting off his knees. Yet something troubles me, Watson. The man was digging, but for what? And why stage such a grotesque discovery? A low, mournful sound drifted across the ruins. A gull, perhaps, or the groan of wood shifting on the tide. It set my nerves jangling. Holmes turned his lantern in a slow arc, illuminating the shattered remains of the cathedral's interior. Amidst the chaos of fallen stone and twisted iron, something caught his attention. "There," he said sharply. "Do you see?" Near the base of a collapsed pillar, half buried in the mud, protruded a sliver of wood. Holmes strode to it at once, kneeling again to examine it more closely. With great care, he worked the object free. It came away with a wet, sucking sound, a wooden box perhaps the size of a small satchel, its surface warped and blackened by years beneath the river. Holmes set it down upon a relatively dry slab of stone and inspected the corroded latch. "Locked," he said, "but not irrevocably." Producing a slender knife from his pocket, he worked patiently at the corroded mechanism. After a few moments there came a sharp click, and the lid creaked open. We peered inside. Within the box, nestled in rotted velvet, lay a single object, a thin, ornate crucifix fashioned of gold, the figure of Christ, intricately wrought and remarkably preserved despite its ordeal. Holmes lifted it gently, turning it in the lantern light. "A relic," I breathed. Holmes's expression darkened, or the bait in a larger trap. He replaced the crucifix carefully and snapped the box shut. "We are dealing with a man who understands not only physical deception, but symbolic power, Watson. Whoever staged this spectacle chose his artifacts with great care." A faint scraping sound interrupted his words. Both of us froze, listening. From somewhere within the ruins, perhaps among the shattered choir stalls or the collapsed transept, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps on stone. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once, plunging us into darkness. He laid a hand on my shoulder, guiding me silently behind a fragment of fallen wall. We crouched low, peering through the swirling mist. A shadow moved among the ruins, a figure slipping between the broken arches, pausing now and then as if searching for something. Holmes's hand tightened briefly on my arm in a silent command for patience. The figure drew closer. Though the mist obscured much, I could just make out the sweep of a dark cloak and the flash of something metallic at the figure's hip. Without warning, the figure turned sharply and disappeared behind a crumbling section of wall. Holmes rose swiftly. "Come, Watson, we must not let him escape." We darted from our cover, splashing through puddles and skirting fallen masonry. The mist seemed to close around us, swallowing sound and distance alike. Holmes led the chase unerringly, following the faint disturbances in the fog, the gleam of displaced water, the soft scuff of hurried footsteps. We rounded a jagged buttress and found ourselves alone. The figure had vanished. Holmes stood very still, his head cocked as if listening for a sound beyond my hearing. At last he turned to me, his face grim. He had slipped through our fingers, for now. He glanced back toward the spot where we had found the box, but not before revealing his hand. "Tonight, Watson, we have seen the first true move of our adversary, and I fear the game has only just begun." Chapter 5. The Mark of the Serpent. The mist still clung to us as we made our way back toward Baker Street, the gold crucifix secured in Holmes's coat pocket, and the memory of the fleeing figure sharp in both our minds. Holmes, though silent during most of the journey, radiated a restless energy. His hands, usually so precise in their movements, tapped ceaselessly against his knees, and more than once he muttered under his breath the words too low for me to catch. It was not until we were seated once more, before the fire of our lodgings, that Holmes finally spoke. "We are dealing, Watson, with a man who understands both spectacle and fear. The cathedral, the corpse, the relic, all arranged to conjure a very particular illusion." I stirred the fire absently. "An illusion of what, Holmes?" He fixed me with a look that was almost pitiful. "Of something ancient, Watson, something forgotten. Our adversary is not merely hiding a crime. He is rewriting history to suit his purpose." I frowned, considering. But why go to such lengths? Surely a simple murder would suffice for whatever ends he pursues. Holmes smiled thinly. "Ah, but there lies the brilliance. A murder invites investigation. A legend, however, invites awe and terror, and very little rational scrutiny." He rose abruptly and crossed to the cluttered writing desk, rummaging through a stack of monographs and old journals. At last he drew out a slim volume, bound in cracked leather, and thumbed quickly through its pages. "Carradine spoke of ancient rites performed at St. Ethelred's," Holmes said, half to himself. "There was talk, even in my university days, of a sect that took root there in the waning days of the 17th century, an offshoot of some obscure Gnostic tradition." He held up the book for my inspection. On the open page was an illustration, faded, but still discernible, of a robed figure standing before an altar, a serpent coiled around his arm. "The Brotherhood of the Serpent's Cross," Holmes said, "a name half remembered, half feared." I leaned closer. "You believe our killer seeks to revive this forgotten brotherhood?" Holmes closed the book with a snap. "I believe he seeks to create the appearance of its revival. To what end we must yet determine." There came a brisk knock at the door. Before I could rise, Mrs. Hudson bustled in, a note balanced on her silver tray. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said. The messenger was most insistent. Holmes accepted the note with a brief nod and unfolded it carefully. As he read, a faint smile touched his lips, a smile I had come to associate with the scent of a worthy adversary. He passed the note to me. The message was brief, written in a bold, angular hand. "Return to the river before the next full tide. Seek the stone that bears the serpent's mark. Only there shall truth be revealed." "A friend?" I looked up in surprise. "Another trap?" I asked. Holmes tapped the note thoughtfully against his fingers. "Almost certainly. And yet, Watson, I find myself unable to resist." The fire crackled in the grate, throwing long, restless shadows against the walls. The stone that bears the serpent's mark, I mused aloud. What could it mean? Holmes turned, back to the fire, his face half-shadowed, his voice low and intent. It means, my dear Watson, that tonight's excursion was only the prologue. The true play is yet to begin. He consulted his pocket watch. The tide turns at dawn. We have precious few hours. He moved to the sideboard, pouring a small measure of brandy into 2 glasses. Rest if you can, Watson. We return to St. Ethelred's before the city stirs. And when we do, I fancy we shall find ourselves standing at the threshold of a truth far stranger and far darker than anything we have yet imagined. I sipped the brandy mechanically, my mind racing. Holmes sat opposite me, motionless now, his keen mind, no doubt, already charting the next moves of a game whose rules we barely understood. Outside the window, the mist thickened once more, drawing its ghostly veil over the sleeping city, as if to hide the secrets that waited for us among the crumbling stones of the sunken cathedral. Chapter 6. The Stone with the Serpent's Mark. The bells of St. Pancras had not yet tolled 5, when Holmes and I arrived once more at the edge of the ruins, the city still slumbering under a blanket of thick morning fog. The river lapped sluggishly at the exposed foundations of St. Ethelred's, the tide at its lowest ebb. All around us the hush of dawn reigned, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant gull. Holmes moved with unusual urgency, his lantern casting long, jagged shadows across the wet stones. In his other hand he held the cryptic note received but hours before, now creased and slightly smudged from repeated study. "We must find it before the water rises again," he said without preamble. "If the message is genuine, the clue lies beneath our feet and may be lost within the hour." We descended cautiously into the ruins, boots sinking slightly into the sodden earth. The once majestic cathedral now resembled a skeleton gnawed. By time, its columns cracked, its roofless nave open to the colourless sky above. The mist seemed to cling more tightly here, as if reluctant to part with the secrets it had guarded for centuries. Holmes stopped suddenly and gestured to a section of flooring that had partially collapsed. A line of broken paving stones extended outward, many of them etched with faint symbols, some no more than weathered scratches, others bearing fragments of old Latin or ecclesiastical iconography. "Here," he murmured, "let us look closely." I knelt beside him and began examining the stones, brushing aside clinging moss and river silt with my gloves. The cold of the stone seeped through the fabric like a chill from another age. After several minutes, Holmes let out a low breath. "There," he said, "by the southern transept." I followed his gaze, half sunken in the mud, nearly concealed by a collapsed timber beam, was a flat slab of dark granite. Upon its surface was carved a crude relief, a coiled serpent encircling a Latin cross, its tongue flickering toward the heavens. "The serpent's mark," I said softly. Holmes was already clearing the area around it. "More than a mark. A signpost. Help me with this beam, Watson." Together, we levered the timber aside with a length of rusted iron we found nearby. The stone beneath groaned as we shifted its weight, revealing a slight depression in the earth. A hollow, perhaps, or the opening to something buried. Holmes knelt, examining the edges. "It is a lid, sealed with age but not impervious." Producing a small crowbar from his satchel, he worked it into the seam and pressed down. The stone resisted, but with a final heave and a wet crack of displaced silt, it tilted upward, revealing a cavity just large enough for a man to enter crouching. Cold gust of air rose from within, earthy, stagnant, and ancient. Holmes passed me the lantern. "Stay close, and be prepared." We descended slowly into the darkness. The passage below was narrow and curved slightly to the left, carved roughly into the bedrock. It sloped downward, and the damp underfoot made each step perilous. The walls were slick with moisture and etched, faintly with more symbols, most indecipherable, but some unmistakably similar to those on the robe worn by the corpse in the mortuary. At last, the passage widened into a low vaulted chamber. Holmes raised the lantern, casting its dim light over the interior. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with alcoves carved directly into the stone. Within each alcove stood an object: a tarnished chalice, a candlestick of twisted brass, a vellum scroll sealed with black wax. At the centre of the room, atop a stone pedestal, lay an open ledger bound in human-looking leather. I stepped forward, heart pounding. The writing was cramped and faded, yet legible. Names, dates, a list stretching back centuries. Holmes scanned it quickly, his expression unreadable. "This is a registry," he said at last. "A record of initiates." "Into what?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the lantern to one of the alcoves and removed the sealed scroll. Breaking the wax, he unrolled it carefully. The parchment crackled faintly. As his eyes moved over the text, his brows drew together. "This is no fantasy, Watson. Someone, perhaps several, have gone to great lengths to fabricate a history of this order. These documents, these relics, they are recent creations meant to appear ancient. But one question remains. Why?" A sharp sound interrupted his thought. A footfall behind us, light but deliberate. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once, plunging us into blackness. We held our breath. A shape moved in the tunnel behind us, its silhouette vague against the faintest suggestion of light from above. Then, slowly, it began to descend. Holmes's voice, barely audible, reached my ear, followed us, and I do not believe he intends for us to leave. I reached for the revolver in my coat pocket, the metal cold and reassuring. The figure paused at the mouth of the chamber. Then a voice, muffled but distinct, echoed in the gloom. "You should not have come here, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped forward, calm as ever, and yet here I am. There was silence for a heartbeat. Then the man drew something from his coat, a glint of metal, and the chamber exploded with light and motion. Chapter 7. A Whisper in the Catacombs. The chamber erupted into chaos. The flash of light, magnesium no doubt, blinded us momentarily, searing after-images into my eyes. Holmes, quicker to recover, lunged to the side, dragging me behind the stone pedestal as something struck the opposite wall with a metallic clang. A pistol shot. We ducked low, backs pressed to the cold stone, as the echo of the gunfire rattled down the tunnel. The acrid tang of spent powder mingled with the damp, ancient air. Holmes reached into his coat and produced his own revolver, passing it to me with a nod. "One shot to startle us," he whispered, voice level. "Not to kill. He wants us frightened, cornered." "And what do we do?" I asked, breath ragged. Holmes's eyes glittered in the gloom. "We unsettle him in return." He reached into his pocket and retrieved a small round mirror, one of those polished signalling tools he sometimes used to examine hard-to-reach crime scenes. With careful aim, he tilted the mirror above the pedestal, angling it toward the passage, entrance. The faint glimmer of light above provided just enough to reveal a shadow crouched at the top of the slope, watching. "He hasn't descended further," Holmes murmured. "Likely believes he has us pinned. But he forgets. Fear is a double-edged sword." Holmes moved with purpose. On the floor beside the pedestal, among the clutter of relics, lay a heavy brass candlestick. He gripped it in one hand, rose silently, and flung it toward the far corner of the chamber. It struck with a resounding crash. A startled grunt echoed from the tunnel. In that moment of confusion, Holmes surged forward with remarkable agility, darting toward the slope. I followed a breath behind, revolver raised. The man above saw us and turned to flee, his boots scraping against the slick rock. We gave chase through the tunnel, the sharp curve and treacherous footing slowing all three of us. But the man had knowledge of the terrain, or perhaps desperation lent him speed, for by the time we reached the entrance, the dawn was beginning to break over the Thames, and he was gone. We emerged breathless, soaked to the knees in brackish water. The tide was rising now, covering the lowest stones of the cathedral once more. Fog still clung to the ground, but the sky beyond glowed with a pale grey light. Holmes turned slowly, scanning the horizon. "A narrow escape for him," he said grimly. I holstered the revolver, nerves still on edge. "Who was he, do you think?" "A guardian, perhaps," Holmes replied. "Or a rival. Either way, he feared what we might find in that chamber." We lingered a moment longer among the ruins. Holmes paced in tight circles, clearly piecing together connections invisible to me. His coat billowed in the morning breeze, and his eyes had that distant burning focus I had come to recognize. "Watson," he said at last, "we are circling a very specific truth, but it remains veiled." He tapped his temple. "This man is not merely a murderer. He is a curator, a builder of myths. The body, the robe, the cathedral's re-emergence. He is weaving a narrative, and every narrative has an audience. You believe this is a performance?" "A performance, yes, but for whom? And why now?" We began our return to Baker Street, the questions multiplying with every step. The streets had begun to stir with early traffic, market carts rattling along the lanes, and children shouting at chimney sweeps on corners. But I could sense Holmes withdrawing inward, the storm in his mind building toward revelation. By the time we reached our sitting room, Holmes had removed the box containing the golden crucifix and placed it on the table between us. "Examine this carefully," he said. I turned the object over in my hand. The gold was oddly light, the back of the figure smooth and flat, unfinished. "It's a forgery," I said aloud. "A good one, but the detail lacks the hand of true craftsmanship." Holmes nodded. "Yes, and the robe, too, was stitched in modern thread. The parchment? No more than 20 years old, artificially aged. The entire chamber beneath the cathedral was constructed fabricated to appear ancient. But to what purpose? I asked again. Holmes glanced at the ledger. That ledger contains names, many of them recognizable. Clergy, politicians, merchants, some dead, others are very much alive. A thought struck me. Could they be blackmail targets? Holmes's gaze sharpened. Precisely. Imagine, Watson, a hidden brotherhood of ancient lineage, with evidence conveniently discovered in a moment of spectacle. A list of names, the illusion of a secret society resurrected from the river's depths. He stood and paced. And now imagine being on that list and receiving a letter. He mimed the words in the air. We know what you were. We know what you pledged. Pay, obey, or we make it public. Even if none of it is real, the damage to one's reputation could be irreversible. A brilliant method of extortion, backed by history itself. My blood ran cold. And the body? Holmes's tone darkened. Someone had to die, Watson, to make the story real. A corpse dressed for ritual, laid among ancient stones, discovered by the right witness. It lends truth to the lie. He crossed to the window and looked out at the mist-shrouded rooftops. We must speak again with Reverend Carradine. I suspect he knows more than he revealed, and I believe our phantom adversary wanted him frightened, for a reason. Holmes turned, face illuminated by the rising sun behind him. We are close now. The performance is entering its final act, and the next move will be ours. Chapter 8. The Reverend's Silence. By midday, the fog had thinned to a light veil across the city, and the brass knocker of Reverend Carradine's Bloomsbury residence rang beneath Holmes's gloved fist. The building was a modest Georgian townhouse, the sort commonly repurposed as scholars' lodgings, tight, scholarly, and dimly lit. A small brass plaque beside the door read, Reverend Elias Carradine, M.A., Antiquarian and Cleric. A moment passed. Then the door opened a crack, revealing a wary maid with a smudge of ink on her apron. Reverend Carradine? Holmes asked crisply. The girl hesitated. He's not receiving visitors, sir. Holmes's expression sharpened by a degree. Nevertheless, inform him that Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson are at the door, and that our visit concerns the matter of life and death which brought him to our rooms only yesterday. The maid blinked at the names, then nodded stiffly, and withdrew. We waited in silence. Somewhere nearby, a clock struck 1. After several minutes, the maid reappeared, gesturing us in. He will see you in the study, sirs. But he's not quite himself today. Holmes gave a nod and followed her down a narrow hall, our footsteps muffled by worn carpeting. The study was a room of shadows. Books lined the walls in floor-to-ceiling shelves, and yellowed maps of ecclesiastical ruins curled gently in frames. A fire burned low in the grate. Carradine sat at a desk near the window, his back to the light. The folds of his clerical coat hung loose about him, and his hands, clasped on the desktop, twitched faintly. When he turned to us, I was struck by the change in his appearance. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale, as if he had not slept. Holmes wasted no time. Reverend, I am here for the truth, and I advise you to offer it now, before others demand it less politely. Carradine's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. He glanced toward the window. Holmes moved to stand before him, his tone lowering but losing none of its sharpness. You told us you stumbled upon the body by chance. That is not the truth. Carradine flinched, and I saw the sweat beginning to gather on his brow. Holmes continued. You knew exactly where to go. You were led there. And I believe the one who led you intended you to be the one to find it. Why? Carradine inhaled shakily. Because I was meant to validate it. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Ah, so the good Reverend lends academic weight to the performance. Carradine sank back into his chair. I didn't know what I was walking into. I swear it. I received a letter 3 nights ago. No signature, only a symbol, the serpent and the cross, drawn in ink on the envelope. Inside was a note, urging me to return to the ruins at once. It claimed that proof of the Brotherhood's rights had surfaced, that I alone would recognize it for what it was. And you went alone? I asked. Yes, the temptation was too great. I have studied the legends of St. Ethelred's for years, always believing there was more buried beneath that place than water and stone. When the cathedral emerged, I thought, perhaps at last something true had returned. But it was staged, Holmes said flatly. Carradine nodded. I see that now. The body, the robe, the symbols, it was all too neat, too theatrical. And then, after I reported it, I began receiving messages. Holmes stepped forward. Threats. Carradine swallowed. Not directly, but they implied that if I contradicted the narrative, if I told the authorities that it was false, then more would be revealed. Things I had written, passages taken from my early monographs, now twisted to serve this myth. I exchanged a look with Holmes. Blackmail through scholarship. Holmes turned back to Carradine. Did the letters mention others? Anyone else named? Carradine hesitated, then nodded. 3. Sir Gavin Fenley, former trustee of the London Museum, Alderman Purdue, and a man known only by the name, Lucian Armitage. Holmes's brows lifted faintly. Armitage! You know the name? I asked. Only from whispers, Holmes replied. A financier with peculiar interests, private libraries, obscure rights, vanished artifacts, always on the edges of scandal, but never touched by it. Carradine's voice dropped. He funded the excavation at Blackwall in '93, the one that unearthed those carved stones, serpent symbols, crude Latin. I wrote a paper on it. Armitage financed the printing. At the time, I believed he was a fellow scholar. Now, I fear I gave him ammunition. Holmes's gaze darkened, and he has been loading the weapon ever since. Carradine reached for a sheaf of papers on his desk and passed it to Holmes. These came last night. I haven't opened them. I couldn't. Holmes unfolded the parchment. Inside were photographs, sepia-toned images of the catacombs we had entered, the relics placed precisely as we had found them, the crucifix glinting beneath the lamplight. There were also pages of what appeared to be a mock history, written in academic style, citing Carradine's own works as references. A manufactured history, Holmes murmured, turning the pages. And you are its unwilling author. Carradine lowered his head into his hands. I was proud once, Mr. Holmes, to search for truth. Now I am being used to spread a lie. Holmes stood in silence, then gently replaced the papers on the desk. You are not the only one, Reverend, but you are the first to see it clearly. He turned to me, face grim. We must find Armitage. Do you think he is our killer? I asked. I think, Holmes said, he is something rarer, a man who murders through belief. And those, Watson, are the most dangerous of all. Chapter 9. The Eyes of Armitage. The fog had lifted by the time we left Carradine's study, replaced by a brittle sunlight that turned the damp stones of the street to dull silver. Holmes walked quickly, his head lowered, hands clasped behind, his back deep in that peculiar state of energy I had come to know well. He said nothing for several blocks, his footsteps precise, deliberate, as though each carried him closer to some conclusion he had not yet spoken aloud. At last he paused outside a tobacconist's near Holborn and drew me aside into a narrow passage between buildings. Armitage, he said quietly, has long been a name whispered on the edge of more respectable society. Theosophists know him. Certain occult circles revere him. But he has always kept himself a shadow. No property under his name, no bank accounts that can be traced, no society membership that survives more than a year. And yet he operates freely, I said. How? Money, Watson, and belief. He offers both, with the poison of secrecy. Men like Carradine believe they are indulging in academic inquiry, until the threads begin to knot into a noose. Armitage is no common criminal. He is a curator of legend, a man who trades in myth as others deal in coins. He turned and hailed. A cab. We shall begin with Sir Gavin Fenley. The ride to the Fenley estate in Kensington passed in a tense silence. Sir Gavin, as we knew, had once been a respected figure. His lectures on iconography at the London Museum were regarded as definitive, but his abrupt resignation 5 years earlier, and the whisper of misappropriated antiquities, had pushed him into a quiet obscurity. The butler who answered the door was discreet, the sort who had grown old in service and accepted irregularity as a matter of course. Sir Gavin receives few visitors, he said, eyes flicking over Holmes's card. But he will see you. We were led through a high-ceilinged corridor into a library that smelled of old parchment and pipe tobacco. Sir Gavin sat in a worn leather armchair, his frame thinner than I remembered from his published portraits. Age had drawn heavy lines along his cheeks and temples, but his eyes, alert, pale and piercing, remained unchanged. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. He gestured to the chairs across from him. You are not here for tea, I assume. No, Holmes said plainly. We are here for Armitage. Fenley flinched at the name, not dramatically, but enough for me to see it registered like a blow behind the eyes. You've been approached, Holmes said. Sir Gavin chuckled darkly. More than approached. Armitage has used me like Carradine. My name, my work, my reputation. He spun a false lineage from a few footnotes in my early texts. Now I am a ghost, alive but silent, preserved in footnotes, to myths I did not create. Why not speak out? I asked. Fenley shook his head. Because it is too late. Too many believe already. A myth, once told often enough, becomes true to those who need it. And Armitage offers them more than belief. He offers them belonging, a secret history, ancient power, noble bloodlines. Lies, all of it, but intoxicating ones. Holmes leaned forward. Do you know where he is? Sir Gavin hesitated. Not precisely, but he has a house, or rather, a place he uses, in Limehouse, dockside, Abandoned paper mill. No signs, no windows left unboarded. But they come and go there, his followers. Quiet, always after dark. I went, once, long ago before I understood. It stinks of wax and river rot. Holmes rose. Thank you, Sir Gavin. You've done more than you know. As we left, Fenley called after us, voice low and burdened. Be careful. You think Armitage is a man. He's not. He's a story, and stories don't die easily. Outside, Holmes hailed another cab. His voice clipped. To Limehouse. Dockside warehouses. Keep your revolver ready, Watson. We rode in silence. The city grew darker the further east we travelled. The streets narrowing, buildings leaning close like conspirators. When we finally emerged near the riverfront, the air had grown sharp with salt and smoke, and the scent of decay drifted in from the water. The old paper mill was easy to spot. Its roof sagged, one side of the structure leaning at an angle, as if the ground beneath it had begun to give way. Windows were black holes. Rusted chains swayed from rotted beams above the alley. Holmes approached the door without hesitation, testing it. It opened silently. Inside, darkness folded around us, broken only by the thin slits of daylight through the boarded slats. Dust motes floated in the air like ash. We moved carefully. Then Holmes stopped. On the far wall, half shrouded in shadow, hung a tattered banner. Upon it, embroidered in black thread, was the serpent and the cross, and beneath it a table laid upon. The table were 9 sealed letters, each marked with wax bearing the serpent's sigil. Holmes moved closer. "They're readying the next act, Watson," he said grimly. "Invitations to the next lie." He turned toward me, eyes narrowed. "We must find Armitage before they begin to believe again." Chapter 10. Beneath the Threshold. Holmes examined the 9 envelopes with care, his gloved fingers running lightly across the black wax seals. Each bore the same serpent and cross sigil, pressed with careful consistency. The paper was thick, expensive, and cut with an almost monastic precision. A ritual of sorts, I thought, more than mere communication. "They're untouched," Holmes murmured. "Freshly sealed. They've not yet been delivered." I moved closer, drawn by the eerie stillness of the room. The walls bore signs of recent occupation, marks where furniture had been dragged, soot from recently extinguished candles. On a small crate beside the table sat a ledger, its cover marked only with the same symbol. Holmes opened it and scanned the first few pages. "Names again," he muttered. "Always the names. Each envelope corresponds to one of these. Powerful men, many of them. Industrialists, a bishop, even a barrister for the Admiralty." He turned a page. "They're all recipients of the myth, soon to be initiated, unless we stop it." My eye caught on something else. Beneath the table, tucked beside a broken crate, was a stack of folded robes, deep red with the same embroidered symbol on the chest. They looked newly made, clean, unfaded by time or river silt. "The same robes the corpse wore," I said. Sir Holmes nodded. "Repetition of imagery. Each element is designed to cement the illusion. The body, the relic, the location, it's all ritual theatre. But what troubles me, Watson, is the question of scale." "Scale?" Holmes gestured at the chamber around us. "This is not the work of one man. Armitage may be the architect, but there are hands at work here. Funding, tailoring, organizing, and not for a private delusion. This is a movement in the making. The faintest noise from deeper within the building froze us both. A soft click, the creak of weight upon a distant floorboard. Holmes drew his revolver and motioned for silence. We slipped behind the crates as another sound followed. A deliberate step, this time closer. Through a crack between planks, I glimpsed a figure in silhouette, pausing in the main corridor. He carried a lantern, its flame casting distorted shadows across the damp stone walls. Holmes watched without blinking. The man turned slowly, as if sensing something amiss, then continued on, passing within 6 feet of our position, footsteps muffled by the damp. His features were obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, his coat collar turned up, but something in his bearing struck me, a stillness, a precision that seemed at odds with the shabbiness of the place. The footsteps receded. A door creaked open, then closed. Holmes exhaled softly and rose. "That was no dockside loiterer," he said. "I believe we've just glimpsed Armitage himself, or one of his lieutenants." He moved swiftly toward the far end of the room, where the floorboards were slightly warped. There, beneath a heavy tarpaulin, he found what he had been hoping for, a trapdoor. "Hidden in plain sight," he murmured, lifting the wood with effort. The hinges groaned, and the scent of mildew rose from below. A narrow stair descended into the dark. "Are you ready, Watson?" As ever, we descended. The chamber beneath was colder, the air stale and unmoving. Brick walls arched low overhead, glistening faintly with condensation. It was a crypt, or something like one, perhaps once used to store goods from the mill above. But it had been repurposed. Dozens of candles stood unlit in iron sconces, arranged in a circle around a central stone dais. Upon the dais rested another box, larger than the one we had found beneath the cathedral. This one was lacquered black, with iron bands and a clasp that bore no lock. Holmes opened it without a word. Inside was a single item, a silver medallion, its surface etched with the same sigil, but surrounded now by unfamiliar characters, some ancient Greek, others of a more esoteric origin. Beneath it lay a parchment, clearly aged with intent, and on it a declaration: "The Brotherhood of the Serpent's Cross is reborn. We vow silence, secrecy, and obedience to the hidden flame. Let the 9 receive their right, and let the tide rise anew." L. Armitage Holmes read it silently, then handed it to me. "This is no longer merely about deception," he said. "It's about control, power through belief, and they are prepared to anoint new members tonight." "Where?" Holmes tapped the parchment. "Let the tide rise anew," he repeated. "It's to happen at the ruins, tonight, with the turning tide." He closed the box gently. "We'll need the police, but not Lestrade, not yet. Too much noise, too much risk of tipping them off. I have someone better in mind." He gave me a pointed look. "I hope your aim is steady, Watson, because when this rite begins, we may be the only witnesses not wearing a robe." Outside, the sky had begun to darken again. Fog curled at the threshold of the door as we emerged into the alley. And far, in the distance, where the river met the shattered bones of St. Ethelred's, the waters had begun once more to recede. Chapter 11. The Rite of the 9. The streets around Limehouse had fallen into a spectral quiet by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. Though it was still early evening, the fog had thickened again, drifting low along the gutters and softening the lamplight into eerie halos. Inside our rooms, Holmes moved with a meticulous urgency, discarding his greatcoat and retrieving a case from beneath the settee. Within it lay a series of tools: a compact lantern, a length of wire, a false beard and spectacles, a short black cloak, and 2 revolvers, his and mine. "We'll go in plain dress, Watson. Too many eyes at the edges of this play. If they sense Scotland Yard closing in, they'll vanish like smoke." "You said you had someone in mind other than Lestrade?" Holmes nodded. "Inspector Bainbridge. He's quiet, precise, and unlike Lestrade, not inclined to laugh when I suggest a centuries-old cult is attempting to blackmail half of Parliament." He handed me the second revolver and checked the cartridges on his own. Then he consulted his watch. "The tide turns at midnight. We have less than 4 hours." By 9:30, we had met Bainbridge in a secluded alley behind Somerset House. A curt man with a clipped moustache and eyes like a hawk's, he listened without interruption as Holmes outlined the details: Carradine, the corpse, the ruins, Armitage, and the Brotherhood's rebirth. Bainbridge's reaction was characteristically terse. "You'll have your men, Holmes, quiet ones. But if this is a hoax—" "If it's a hoax," Holmes said flatly, "then someone is dead for the sake of theatrics, and 9 of London's most influential men are about to pledge themselves to a lie. Either way, we must be there when the curtain rises." By 11, we were in place. We approached the cathedral ruins under cover of fog, skirting along the water's edge until the dark, jagged silhouette of St. Ethelred's rose before us. It looked different by moonlight, less like a ruin, more like the skeleton of a cathedral waiting to rise again. The tide had pulled back just enough to reveal the floor of the nave and the crooked stones where the false body had once lain. The men arrived in silence. From the shadows, Holmes and I counted them: 9 figures in crimson robes, their faces masked by hoods. They came singly and in pairs, each carrying something small in hand: scrolls, boxes, or unlit candles. They took their places in a wide circle around the dais, where an iron brazier now stood filled with coals, its surface etched with runes. The same silver medallion Holmes had recovered from the paper mill now hung from a chain above the brazier, glinting like a relic pulled from hell itself. Then came the 10th figure. Tall, straight-backed, cloaked in deeper crimson and without a mask. His face was narrow and serene, his mouth composed in the faintest hint of a smile. Even from a distance, I knew him. So did Holmes. "Armitage," Holmes whispered. He stepped forward into the circle, arms raised. "Brothers," he began, voice smooth and echoing off the stones, "you have come as summoned, chosen by your histories, your bloodlines, your truths. Tonight the veil is lifted. The Brotherhood lives again." A murmur passed through the assembled men. Holmes leaned toward me. "They don't know the others. See how they glance about. Each believes he is alone among peers. They've been isolated deliberately." Armitage produced a scroll and began to read in Latin first, then in English. It was the same invocation we'd found beneath the cathedral. A vow of silence, obedience, loyalty to the hidden flame. As he spoke, 2 robed acolytes lit the brazier. The flames rose quickly, fed by some chemical accelerant that made the fire burn green and blue. "Now," Holmes muttered. "We move now." We rose from our concealment behind the collapsed apse wall. Holmes stepping forward with confidence, revolver in hand, voice ringing out, "Lucien Armitage, your charade ends tonight." The circle broke in an instant. Several of the hooded men cried out and stumbled backward. Others pulled away their masks in shock. One, a balding man with a signet ring, turned to flee, but Bainbridge's constables emerged from the fog to block the path. Armitage, to his credit, did not move. He stood by the brazier, hands calmly folded. "Mr. Holmes," he said without raising his voice, "you are precisely on time. Then you'll know why we're here. The body, the relics, the names, all a fabrication for blackmail. A performance. And these men," Holmes said, gesturing to the startled initiates, "are your audience." Armitage tilted his head. "Blackmail, Mr. Holmes?" "No, transformation. These men crave meaning. They came willingly, desperate for something older, grander than the Empire." Holmes stepped forward. "They were chosen because of their pasts, flaws you could exploit, secrets you could sell. This entire brotherhood is a tapestry of lies." Armitage's smile deepened. "Truth is what men agree to believe, and they were ready to believe me." Holmes didn't reply. Instead, he turned to the men, now being separated and questioned by Bainbridge's men. "Each of you was approached in isolation. Each told that the others were part of an ancient order. Each shown forged relics, dead scholars' names, and a corpse dressed for ritual. You have been duped, but the law will treat the deceived differently than the deceiver." 2 constables moved to seize Armitage. He raised no protest. But as they took him, he turned once more to Holmes. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes, but you think it's too small. There are others. There always are. You may scatter the flock, but the myth is sown. It will grow again." Holmes looked at him with cold precision. "Then I shall be there when it does." Armitage was led away. As the tide began to rise once more, and the flames of the brazier hissed into steam, Holmes and I stood at the centre of the false rite, the medallion swinging gently in the air between us. "A man tried to raise a legend," Holmes said softly, "and very nearly succeeded." "But you stopped him," I replied. Holmes said nothing. His eyes lingered on the rising river, where the waters crept slowly back over the stones, burying the past once more. Chapter 12. The River Forgets. But Holmes does not. It was 3 days later when Holmes and I sat once more before the fire at 201B Baker Street. The morning paper spread across his lap, and the remnants of our late breakfast untouched. Outside, London bustled in its usual indifferent rhythm. Cabs rattled, vendors called out, and the Thames, muddy and grey, rolled on without care for the secrets it had so recently yielded. Across the front page, in bold ink, ran the headline, "Bogus Occult Society. Unmasked, prominent men among duped initiates." Beneath it a smaller line, "Detective Holmes and Scotland Yard break ritual fraud at Sunken Cathedral." I lowered my teacup. They've kept it respectable, all things considered. Bainbridge must have leaned on the editors to soften the scandal. Holmes didn't look up. Of course, the Yard would prefer the public believe it was a curious criminal scheme, quickly squashed, not a philosophical virus that nearly took root among the upper class. He tapped the paper lightly. And Armitage? In custody, I said. Refuses to speak, not even to his solicitor. Holmes gave a faint hum of interest, folding the paper with care. He has already said all he needed to. The performance was the message. The myth, the relics, the ritual. It was never about faith. It was about influence. Power through reverence, bought through fear. He turned to the small lacquered box on the mantel. Inside, the forged silver medallion glinted softly in the firelight. Fascinating, Watson. He never intended the Brotherhood to last, not as a real institution. Its value was in its discovery, in the thrill of being part of something ancient. Once those men believed, he could extract favors, money, and silence. The lie didn't have to survive long, just long enough to entangle them. I nodded slowly. And the corpse? Holmes grew quiet. I had Mycroft pull the autopsy results from St. Swithin's. The body was that of a man named Reuben Glass, a stage actor, formerly of the Bristol Company. He'd vanished from public notice nearly a year ago. Murdered? Holmes' face was unreadable. No trauma, no poison that the coroner could detect. But the lungs were filled with silt, river silt, Watson, as though he had been drowned, not in water, but in mud, likely suffocated with it before being posed among the ruins. A death crafted not merely to silence, but to symbolize. I shivered. A man died for a story. Holmes glanced at me. Men have always died for stories. Armitage simply chose to write his own. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a small envelope. For you, Mr. Holmes. Came by private hand. No return address. Holmes opened it without comment, drawing forth a single slip of paper. His eyes scanned it once. Then again, he passed it to me. Written in precise, flowing script were the words, "The river remembers. So do we. The tide will turn again." As there was no signature. Only the same serpent and cross sigil, now stamped in red ink. I looked up at Holmes. A follower. Or a successor, he said. He rose and moved to the window, staring out at the drifting fog over the rooftops. Armitage may fall, but the idea has taken root. I joined him. Then it's not over. Holmes shook his head. Nothing ever truly ends, Watson. It merely waits beneath the surface until the world is ready to believe again. And with that, we stood in silence as the clock ticked and the river rolled on, its grey waters whispering secrets only Holmes could ever hope to hear.